Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We will expand today the geographical coverage of our series Sanctions 360 Degrees to the region of Central America and the Caribbean by looking at three separate jurisdictions, Guatemala, Haiti, and Nicaragua. We quite clearly miss one important country from the region in the context of international and national sanctions, which is Cuba. But Cuba is a jurisdiction in case of itself, been subject to a most comprehensive and the longest embargo imposed against Cuba by the United States, as well as multiple other restrictions. So that country clearly deserves separate coverage. And today we would look, as we typically do in our series, at the following points. We would first put these jurisdictions in the sanctions perspective, taking into account the historical and political background, trying to explain the reasons why these countries are subject to international and national sanctions. Then we would cover the UN sanctions in the first place and conclude by covering key national sanctions regimes. Typically, we'll look at the United States, the UK, and the European Union in our short series. Certainly, it would be incorrect to say that Guatemala, Haiti, and Nicaragua have a common historical background. This statement would be correct for Guatemala and Nicaragua, which are part of the same region of Central America and were subject to the similar colonial rule by the Spanish. Then were a part of the Mexican Empire, a part of the Federation of the Countries of Central America, and later became independent states. But certainly Haiti has a history of its own, being the first Black republic in the world in 1804, when the Black population of the Ireland, primarily the dissidents from Africa, rebelled against the white colonial minority and, in essence, in the course of a military conflict which lasted for more than 10 years, gained their independence. Nevertheless, from the sanctions perspective, and that's the focus of our series, there are certain similarities, apart from the relative geographical closeness, which allow us to group the three jurisdictions in a single presentation. One of those similarities is certainly the colonial background and those injustices which the colonial rule perpetuated in all of those countries, which are primarily the distribution of land, concentrated in the hands of the very few, as those three countries were developed as agricultural, single-focused economies, where the land would be concentrated within the hands of a minority, and the majority either of local population, as in case of Guatemala and Nicaragua, or to a large extent reliant on the slave trade, as in case of Haiti, would work on those agricultural plantations, primarily focused on the production of a single crop like coffee, cacao, indigo, or sugarcane. The second point is the colonial foreign debt, most clearly evident in case of Haiti, which, despite gaining independence as a result of its military uprising, and nevertheless was forced by France to pay off for its independence one more time, now with money. In essence, France threatened New Republic of invasion unless it accepts to compensate the slave owners for the liberty which their slaves gained as a result of the independence struggle. A very substantial debt was imposed on Haiti, which to pay off Haiti has to borrow from French and later US banks. And in essence, the debt enchained this country for more than 100 years and, of course, substantially impeded its economic development. Single commodity economies, which we've already discussed, resulted in high vulnerability of the economies of these countries to the world fluctuation in market prices for those commodities, as well as little diversification, as given this focus of national economies, the elite was not really interested in any type of development of alternative industries. So certainly these historical injustices which prevailed since the start of colonialism, which was late 15th century, and up until case of Haiti, it gained its independence, but in fairness continued through the 19th century, certainly created the fertile soil for military dictatorship regimes, which prevailed across the three jurisdictions, even once the countries became independent and colonialism as a notion disappeared. So in the 20th century, these countries were ruled primarily by dictatorship regimes, which tried to keep in place these structures of the economies where a minority would control the main resources in the country. And quite often those regimes were supported or even encouraged by the local powers, as it was the case in the, for example, United Fruit Company orchestrated regime change in Guatemala, as well as, for example, support for Contras in Nicaragua. These are not the matters of even middle of the 20th century. Quite recently, when the president of Haiti, Aristide, raised the point of the compensation from former colonial powers of France and those powers who benefited from Haiti colonial debt, like the US banks. So once he raised the point that these powers need to compensate Haiti for the damage imposed on its economy and its development as a result of those debts, he was quickly again ousted from power in his country. So certainly these further undermine the state institutions in these countries, created fertile soil for corruption, and as a result of this, even today, these countries are often subject to rapid regime change. Presidents of the country have been accused and sentenced for participating in cross-border crimes and similar types of activities. In addition to this, the Cold War context certainly added its own layer of complexity and of instability and of military intervention to these smaller nations, which often became a pawn in a big chess game between main superpowers of the Cold War period, and who often had very little regard for what these nations would wish for themselves and would rather consider them to be their backyard territories, which should follow in the course of the main political discourse. We clearly saw this in case of Nicaragua, which following its left-wing revolution in 1979 then had to face the military intervention of Contras supported by the United States. But that was not just the case of Nicaragua. The same was in Guatemala, where a 30-year civil war between left and right-wing representatives of the society, in essence, resulted in more than 200,000 people dead, as well as elements of what some people consider to be even the vestiges of genocide of the local dissidents of Maya, people living in the country. On top of this, if we look from the current day perspective, additional complexities add to already quite fragile environment in these countries, which results from, in the first place, environmental degradation. This country is located in the seismically active zone, so earthquakes of substantial magnitude are quite frequent. And most recently, we witnessed the earthquakes in Haiti in 2010 in Port-au-Prince, which in essence ruined substantial parts of the capital of the country, even further adding to the fragility of those state institutions which try to develop these regions. In addition to earthquakes, obviously the region is subject to hurricanes. And on top of the environmental degradation, certainly transborder crime is an important factor, which adds to further erosion of the institutions in the regions where drug trafficking to the United States, as well as illegal immigration, arms trafficking, and trafficking of some rare species of fish or animals is another important considerations. So all in all, the factors which result in the imposition of the sanctions, as we would see, are complex. They're often very much politicized. I think this is the region where sanctions are mostly politicized to a large extent and are prone to criticism from that basis. It's often impossible to explain on any objective type of standard why one country or the other is subject to sanctions, but not neighbor nations. But then if we put that historical and political context within the sanctions frames of today, this is better understood from that perspective. We'll first now look at the UN sanctions which are currently in place, which, contrary to what I've just said, as of today may be described as an objective means to address an acute problem, which is the gang violence in Haiti. All the issues which we've just discussed, colonial legacy, huge debt imposed on Haiti following its independence, which they in essence managed to repay just at the beginning of 20th century, and to bring that in the context, the amount of debt multiple times exceeded the GDP of Haiti at the time it was imposed, together with the environmental degradation which affected the country, not just as a result of its geographical location, but also because of deforestation, as the country has to cut substantial amount of its forests to repay the debt, together with the issues which I've discussed, in essence, destroyed the state and state institutions in the country, and following several extremely violent earthquakes which affected the country over the last 10 years, in essence resulted in the collapse of state institutions and the propagations of violent gangs which currently control substantial parts of the country, in essence displacing the state's institutions there. From that perspective, the UN, which track record in Haiti is very mixed, at least as far as the peacekeeping missions are concerned. From the sanctions perspective, certainly imposed measures which are objectively required and which consist of three typical sanctions of the United Nations, being the arms embargo, asset freeze and travel ban. And in case of Haiti sanctions, those are imposed exclusively against the gangs and their leaders. Two key gangs operating in Haiti are sanctioned in their own name, as well as the leaders of the remaining gangs, which, given that the UN sanctions regimes operate with the control and ownership criteria, in essence means that those sanctions apply to all gangs and their members operating on the territory of Haiti. Certainly, the most important is the arms embargo, as the continuous flow of arms is what keeps these gangs active, and not only active, but managing to put under their control additional parts of the territory of the country. So the key focus of all UN member states, as the UN sanctions are mandatory for all member states, should be on ensuring strict compliance with arms embargo. And from that perspective, three main countries are within the focus of this requirement in the first place, one being the United States, being the main supplier of the market where those arms are purchased by the intermediaries allowing the Haitian gangs to have access to those arms. Then the Dominican Republic, another state on the island of Hispaniola, sharing the border with Haiti, through which substantial amount of those arms is trafficked through to Haiti. And then the Haiti itself, certainly Haiti itself, which is a member of the United Nations and as such is obliged to ensure the compliance with the UN embargo in its own name as a member state, and is obliged to ensure that the supply of arms to the gangs is put on hold. Certainly in case of Haiti, compliance with this requirement is problematic given that the government does not control all ports of the country, let alone the territory, and accordingly is not always able even to enforce the UN sanctions embargo. Looking at the key national regimes, we'll start with the United States. Certainly, the United States as a big power have the main interest, both political and economic in the region, which we've discussed briefly in our historical expose to the sanctions presentation. And we can see that in the current US politics, even today, the Cold War mentality continues to play an important role in defining their sanctions policy, so to say, as out of all the countries in the region, apart from Cuba, which is certainly another evidence of this mentality remaining in place, Nicaragua is the jurisdiction which is subject to the most comprehensive sanctions regimes, where in addition to designating the members of the governing class of Nicaragua, which certainly following the Ortega's coming back to power is problematic for the United States from the ideological perspective. It continues to sanction certain parts of the economy of Nicaragua, in particular its gold sector, by designating some of its gold-producing companies to the US as the end list, as a result of which designations those companies in essence become cut off international markets in trade and financial services. As far as other jurisdictions in this region is concerned, the US primarily view them as a transitory route for transnational crime, drug trafficking, and terrorism. And so the current sanctions designations are made within the regimes which are addressing those issues. So for example, in case of Haiti, the designations of the main gangs are made under the US anti-terrorism executive orders, as well as the Immigration and Nationality Act, whereby the same gangs which are designated to the UN blocking sanctions lists are designated as the foreign terrorist organizations or special designated global terrorist organizations, which in essence imposes them to a harsher regime from the US perspective, because any kind of affiliation or any kind of economic support for those organizations becomes impossible. And by doing so, in essence, the message is that those issues will be dealt with in those kind of subject matter, so to say, sanctions, rather than country-specific sanctions. Looking at the UK and the European Union, here the sanctions are more focused and more limited in nature. The focus is either on the implementation of the UN sanctions, as is in case of Haiti, or as is in case of Nicaragua and Guatemala, the focus is on those election irregularities, which from the perspective of the jurisdictions, meaning the European Union and the United Kingdom, occurred in Nicaragua and Guatemala during the recent election cycles. So the persons and the violence, certainly, which followed those elections, when many civilians were subject to violent treatment by the police. And the designations relate primarily for those persons who are responsible either for what is perceived to be election fraud or the following violence. The European Union has 3 regulations, which in essence impose asset freeze, travel ban, sanctions on the persons who are responsible for those type of activities, as well as any entities owned or controlled by those persons, together with the member states being obliged to introduce the arms embargo. As with the United States, many designations in the regions are made not within the country-specific regimes, but within the regimes which deal with specific issues which are addressed by way of sanctions, being either corruption or drug trafficking, international crime, or human rights abuses. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations.